The Galactic Council had ruled the stars for 12,000 years. They controlled hundreds of worlds across the Orion Arm. They had conquered dozens of species and built an empire that stretched across light years of space. No one had ever challenged them. No one had ever dared. High Arbiter Eth sat in his throne room on the Council's capital world, reviewing reports from his scouts. They had found a new planet in a distant corner of the galaxy, a small blue world orbiting a yellow star. The planet was called Earth by its inhabitants, and those inhabitants called themselves humans. The scouts had watched Earth for several months. They had intercepted the planet's radio signals and studied the species from afar. Their report was simple: humans were primitive. They had only recently discovered space travel. Their ships were slow and weak. Their weapons were crude. They spent most of their time fighting each other over land, resources, and ideas that made no sense to the Council observers. Eth read the report and saw an opportunity. The Council always needed new territory. They always needed new resources, and they always needed new species to serve them. Earth would be an easy conquest. The humans would surrender quickly, just like every other primitive species the Council had encountered. He ordered the invasion fleet to prepare. 300 warships gathered at the edge of Council space. They were the finest vessels in the galaxy, armed with plasma cannons that could melt mountains and shields that could withstand the force of a small sun. Each ship carried thousands of soldiers bred for war and trained from birth to fight. The fleet commander was Admiral, a veteran of 50 campaigns who had never known defeat. He reviewed his orders with satisfaction. This would be a simple mission. They would arrive at Earth, demand surrender, and crush any resistance. The whole operation would take perhaps a week. The fleet jumped through hyperspace and arrived in Earth's solar system on a Tuesday morning. They emerged near the planet Jupiter, their sensors scanning the system for threats. They found none. A few primitive satellites orbited Earth. A handful of small space stations floated near the planet. There was nothing that could challenge the Council's might. Admiral ordered the fleet to broadcast their message across every frequency. The transmission was simple and direct. It announced that Earth was now property of the Galactic Council. All humans were ordered to surrender immediately. Any resistance would result in the complete destruction of their civilization. They had 24 hours to respond. The message reached Earth within minutes. It interrupted television broadcasts across the planet. It appeared on computer screens and phone displays. It echoed through radio stations and emergency alert systems. For the first time in human history, everyone on Earth heard the same message at the same moment. The world fell silent. People stopped in the streets and stared at the sky. Governments convened emergency meetings. Military forces went on high alert. Scientists confirmed what everyone feared: the transmission was real. Alien warships had arrived in their solar system, and they were demanding surrender. The first response came not from any government, but from a retired schoolteacher in Kansas named Harold Mitchell. He had been operating his ham radio when the transmission arrived, and he responded without thinking. His message was simple: "New phone, who dis?" Admiral received the strange reply and dismissed it as noise. He ordered his fleet to advance toward Earth, confident that the humans would soon understand their situation. But something unexpected was happening on the blue planet below. The United Nations Security Council met within hours of the transmission. Representatives from every major nation crowded into the chamber, their faces grim but determined. They argued about how to respond. Some wanted to negotiate. Others wanted to fight. A few suggested surrender might be the choice. General Stone of the United States listened to the debate with growing impatience. He had spent 30 years preparing for this exact scenario. Everyone had called him paranoid. Everyone had said alien invasion was science fiction. But Stone had always believed humanity needed to be ready for anything. He stood and addressed the assembly. His voice was calm and steady. He explained that surrender was not an option. Any species that demanded total submission on first contact was not interested in peace. They were interested in conquest, and conquered peoples never fared well under their masters. Stone opened a red folder he had carried into the chamber. Inside was a document titled Contingency 7. It outlined a plan for exactly this situation, a plan that had been developed in secret over decades, a plan that would require every nation on Earth to work together as they never had before. The debate continued for hours, but slowly the mood in the chamber shifted. Fear gave way to anger. Despair gave way to determination. These aliens had come to their home uninvited. They had threatened their families, their children, their entire species, and humans did not respond well to threats. The vote was unanimous. Every nation agreed to invoke Contingency 7. Every nation agreed to fight. The formal response to the Council was drafted carefully. It acknowledged receipt of their transmission. It rejected their demands completely, and it included a counter-declaration of war signed by 193 nations. At the bottom of the document, someone had added a handwritten note. "You have no idea what you've just started." Admiral received the response and laughed. He had seen species try to resist before. He had watched them fight bravely and die quickly. These humans were no different. They were primitive creatures who had no understanding of what they faced. He transmitted the human response back to High Arbiter Eth, along with his own assessment. The humans had chosen war. They would regret that choice very soon. Eth read the message in his throne room and felt a moment of unease. Something about the human response troubled him. There was no fear in their words, no desperation, no pleading for mercy or time to reconsider. There was only defiance, pure, absolute defiance. He dismissed the feeling as foolish. The Council had conquered species far more advanced than humans. They had broken civilizations that had existed for millions of years. What could a bunch of primitive apes possibly do against the greatest military power in the galaxy? He authorized Admiral to begin the invasion at his discretion. The conquest of Earth would proceed as planned. But somewhere deep in his ancient mind, a small voice whispered a warning. These humans were different. Something about them was wrong. Something about them was dangerous. Eth ignored the voice. It was the worst mistake he would ever make. Admiral led his fleet toward Earth with complete confidence. His ships moved in perfect formation, their sensors scanning for any sign of human resistance. He expected to find primitive vessels crewed by frightened soldiers. He expected a quick and easy victory. The first human ships appeared near Jupiter's moons. There were only 12 of them, small and battered vessels that looked like they had been built from spare parts. Their hulls were covered in patches and repairs. Their weapons systems were barely functional. They moved slowly and clumsily through space. Smiled when he saw them. This was the best humanity could offer, these pathetic ships against his mighty fleet. He almost felt sorry for the humans. They were so hopelessly outmatched that the battle would be over in minutes. He ordered a scouting party of 12 destroyers to engage the human vessels. There was no need to waste his entire fleet on such easy prey. The destroyers accelerated toward the human ships, their weapons charging for what would surely be a one-sided fight. Sub-Commander led the scouting party. He was a young officer eager to prove himself in combat. He watched the human ships on his display and calculated the optimal attack pattern. His destroyers would surround the enemy and destroy them with concentrated plasma fire. Simple and efficient. But as his ships approached, something strange happened. The human vessels suddenly accelerated toward his fleet. They were not trying to escape or find defensive positions. They were charging directly at his destroyers at maximum speed. Felt the first hint of confusion. This made no tactical sense. The human ships were weaker and slower than his own. A direct charge would only result in their faster destruction. What were they thinking? The answer came seconds later. The human ships exploded. But they did not explode randomly or accidentally. They exploded forward, toward the Council destroyers. The blasts released clouds of metal fragments, nuclear warheads, and crude projectiles that traveled at enormous speeds. Had no time to react. The wave of debris hit his fleet like a hammer. 3 destroyers were destroyed instantly, their shields overwhelmed by the sheer volume of impacts. 4 more were crippled, their engines torn apart and their weapons disabled. The remaining ships scattered in panic and confusion. His own vessel survived, but barely. He stared at his display in shock. 7 of his 12 destroyers were gone or disabled, and the humans had sacrificed only 12 small ships to achieve this result. The humans had not tried to win the battle. They had tried to hurt him as badly as possible before dying, and they had succeeded beyond anything could have imagined. He retreated to the main fleet and reported to Admiral. The Admiral listened to his account with growing disbelief. This was not how warfare was supposed to work. Civilized species tried to preserve their ships and soldiers. They fought for territory and resources. They did not throw away their lives in suicide attacks. But the humans did not seem to care about their own survival. They cared only about making the Council pay for every inch of space. The second engagement went even worse. Sent a larger force this time, 50 warships to crush any resistance. They encountered a human fleet of 30 vessels near the asteroid belt. The battle lasted 3 hours. The Council ships had superior technology in every way. Their weapons were stronger, their shields were tougher, and their soldiers were better trained. But the humans fought with a ferocity that logic. They used asteroids as weapons, redirecting them into the paths of Council ships. They deployed mines hidden in debris fields. They rammed their damaged vessels into enemy targets rather than retreat. They fought to the last ship, the last crew member, the last breath. When the battle ended, the Council had won. But they had lost 18 warships in the process. 18 of the finest vessels in the galaxy, destroyed by a species that had only discovered space travel a generation ago. Sat in his command center and studied the battle reports. Something was very wrong here. The humans were not fighting like a primitive species should fight. They were fighting like they had been preparing for this war their entire existence. He requested additional intelligence from the Council archives. What he learned disturbed him deeply. Humans had been at war with themselves for their entire history. They had fought over land, over resources, over ideas, over things that made no sense to outside observers. They had developed weapons of terrible destruction and used them against their own kind. They had refined the art of warfare across thousands of years of constant conflict. The Council had conquered many species, but they had never encountered one like this. Most civilizations developed warfare as a last resort, a tool used only when all other options failed. But humans had made warfare central to their culture. They wrote songs about it. They told stories about it. They honored those who fought and died in battle. And now all that experience, all that knowledge, all that terrible expertise was being directed at the Council. Ambassador who had spent her career studying alien species. She was summoned to provide analysis of the human threat. Her report was classified at the highest level. Humans, she explained, had evolved as persistent predators. On there, they had hunted by chasing their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. They were not the fastest or strongest creatures on their planet, but they never gave up. They never stopped. They followed their targets across miles of terrain until victory was inevitable. This same psychology applied to their warfare. Humans did not fight to win quickly. They fought to outlast their enemies. They could absorb terrible losses and keep fighting. They could adapt to any situation and find new ways to attack. They could endure hardships that would break any other species. "We have made a terrible mistake," wrote in her conclusion. "We assumed the humans were primitive because their technology was limited, but technology can be acquired. What cannot be acquired is the will to fight, the ability to endure, and the refusal to accept defeat. The humans possess these qualities in abundance. Read the report and felt true fear for the first time in his long career. He had commanded fleets against dozens of species. He had never encountered anything like this. He sent a message to High Arbiter Eth requesting permission to withdraw and reassess the situation. The humans were more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. They needed time to develop new strategies and tactics. Eth the request. The Council could not be seen retreating from a primitive species. Their reputation, their authority, their entire empire depended on the perception of invincibility. The invasion would continue as planned. Received his orders and obeyed, but he knew in his heart that the Council had made a terrible error. They had awakened something ancient and dangerous, something that would not stop until one side or the other was completely destroyed. The war had only just begun, and already the Council was losing. 3 months had passed since the Council declared war on Earth. The invasion that was supposed to take 1 week had become a nightmare that showed no sign of ending. Admiral sat in his command center and reviewed the latest reports. His fleet had lost over 60 warships. His ground forces had suffered casualties that would have ended any previous campaign, and the humans showed no sign of weakening. If anything, they were growing stronger every day. The ground invasion had been particularly disastrous. Council troops had landed on Earth expecting easy conquest. They had the best weapons, the best armor, and the best training in the galaxy. They had conquered dozens of worlds without significant losses. But Earth was different. Earth was a death trap. The humans did not fight like any species the Council had encountered before. They did not form neat battle lines or follow predictable tactics. They appeared from nowhere, struck hard, and vanished before the Council troops could respond. They used the terrain to their advantage, fighting in mountains, forests, jungles, and cities where superior technology meant little. Ground Commander Han had led campaigns across 100 worlds. He had never experienced anything like Earth. His soldiers were being killed by enemies they never saw. Snipers picked them off from impossible distances. Explosive devices were hidden in roads, buildings, and even the bodies of fallen humans. Every step forward cost lives. The human civilians were just as dangerous as their soldiers. Old women threw acid from windows. Children reported troop movements to resistance fighters. Farmers hid weapons in their fields and attacked at night. There was no clear line between combatant and civilian. Everyone on Earth seemed ready to fight. Han requested permission to use orbital bombardment. If they could not conquer the humans on the ground, they would destroy them from space. But the Council wanted Earth intact. They wanted its resources, its people, its potential. Burning the planet to glass would defeat the purpose of the invasion. So the ground forces continued their slow, bloody advance, and with each passing day, they fell further behind. But the true shock came when the Council analyzed captured human technology. Their scientists had expected to find crude weapons barely capable of damaging Council armor. What they found instead terrified them. The humans had been studying Council equipment since the first battles. Every captured weapon, every piece of debris, every fragment of technology had been collected and analyzed. Human engineers worked around the clock, disassembling Council devices and figuring out how they worked. Within weeks, humans had reverse-engineered Council plasma rifles. Within a month, they had cracked the frequencies of Council shield technology. Within 2 months, they had built their own versions of Council weapons, crude but effective copies that filled the gaps in their arsenal. Chief Scientist L reported his findings to Admiral with visible distress. The humans were adapting faster than any species in Council history. They were not just copying technology. They were improving it, combining it with their own designs to create hybrid weapons that were sometimes superior to Council originals. They learn from everything we do, L explained. Every weapon we use against them teaches them something new. Every tactic we employ is studied and countered. They are evolving in real time, becoming more dangerous with each engagement. The industrial capacity of Earth was equally shocking. The Council had dismissed human factories as primitive pollution producers. They had assumed Earth's manufacturing capabilities were limited and easily destroyed. They were wrong. Humanity converted its entire industrial base to war production. Automobile factories began building tanks and weapons. Shipyards that once produced cargo vessels now produced warships. Electronics manufacturers switched to military communications and sensors. Every factory, every workshop, every garage on Earth became part of the war effort. The humans worked in shifts around the clock. They did not stop for rest or comfort. They pushed themselves to the breaking point and beyond, driven by a desperate determination to survive. New shipyards appeared in the asteroid belt, built from nothing in weeks. Mining operations expanded to gather resources from moons and distant rocks. Space stations were constructed to serve as military bases and manufacturing centers. The humans were expanding into space faster than anyone had thought possible. Admiral watched the human fleet grow with each passing week. Ships that had been destroyed were replaced within days. New designs appeared constantly, each one incorporating lessons learned from previous battles. The primitive vessels that had first challenged his fleet were being replaced by warships that could almost match Council technology. Ambassador submitted another report to the Council. Her analysis was even more alarming than before. Human psychology includes a phenomenon they call spite, she wrote. When threatened with destruction, humans do not simply try to survive. They try to ensure their enemies suffer as much as possible. They will endure incredible hardship just to see their opponents hurt. This is not rational behavior by Council standards, but it is deeply embedded in human nature. She continued with another observation. Humans also possess what they call hope. Even in the most desperate situations, they believe victory is possible. This belief allows them to keep fighting when logic says they should surrender. It makes them unpredictable and extremely dangerous. High Arbiter Eth read the reports in his throne room and felt the foundations of his confidence crumble. The invasion was supposed to demonstrate Council power. Instead, it was revealing Council weakness. Word was spreading to other species in the Empire. Whispers of human resistance were inspiring dangerous thoughts among the conquered peoples. He summoned his war council and demanded solutions, but his advisors had none to offer. The humans were fighting a kind of war the council had never faced, a war of endurance, adaptation, and absolute refusal to quit. Some advisors suggested negotiation. Perhaps the humans would accept a compromise. Perhaps they would agree to peace in exchange for their independence. Eth rejected the suggestion with contempt. The council did not negotiate with inferior species. They conquered or they destroyed. There was no middle ground. But as the weeks passed and the casualties mounted, Eth began to wonder if the council had finally met a species that could not be conquered. A species that would rather die than submit. A species that had been preparing for exactly this kind of war since the dawn of their civilization. The thought kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling of his chambers and wondering how everything had gone so wrong. On Earth, General Stone reviewed the same reports with very different emotions. The war was far from over. Millions had died and millions more would follow, but humanity was still standing. They were still fighting, and they were getting better every day. Stone looked at the latest intelligence on Council supply lines and smiled. The humans had been defending so far, absorbing losses and learning from each engagement. But that phase was almost over. Soon, very soon, humanity would go on the offensive. And then the Council would truly understand what they had awakened. 6 months of war had changed everything. The Council invasion that was supposed to demonstrate unstoppable power had become a symbol of failure. Their fleet was battered, their army was bleeding, and humanity was about to strike back. Admiral Wei stood on the bridge of her flagship and studied the tactical display. The ship was called the Defiance, and 6 months ago it had been a cargo freighter hauling supplies between Earth and Mars. Now it was the command vessel of humanity's first offensive fleet, armed with weapons that combined human ingenuity and stolen Council technology. Wei had spent her entire career preparing for a war she never expected to fight. She had risen through the ranks of Earth's unified space force, earning a reputation for unconventional thinking and aggressive tactics. When the Council invaded, she had been placed in command of the most ambitious operation in human history. They called it Operation Homecoming. The name was deliberately chosen to send a message. Humanity was not just defending their home, they were announcing their arrival on the galactic stage. The plan had been developed over months of careful preparation. Human intelligence operatives had mapped Council supply lines with painstaking detail. They had identified weak points, vulnerable stations, and critical that kept the invasion fleet supplied and functional. Without those supply lines, the Council fleet would starve. Wei reviewed her forces one last time. She had 112 warships under her command. Most of them were converted civilian vessels, armed with whatever weapons could be fitted to their hulls. Some were captured Council ships, repaired and crewed by human volunteers. A few were purpose-built warships, the first products of Earth's expanded military industry. Her fleet was outnumbered by the remaining Council forces. Her ships were generally weaker and slower than their opponents. By any rational calculation, she should not be launching an offensive. She should be holding defensive positions and waiting for the enemy to make mistakes. But Wei understood something that the Council did not. War was not won by playing it safe. War was won by taking risks, by striking when the enemy least expected it, by refusing to follow the rules that your opponent assumed you would follow. The attack began at midnight Earth time. Human raider squadrons hit Council supply stations across 3 different sectors simultaneously. These were small groups of fast ships crewed by volunteers who knew they might not survive. Their mission was simple: cause as much damage as possible and create chaos. The raid succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Council defenders, spread thin across thousands of light years, could not respond to attacks happening everywhere at once. Supply depots burned, fuel stations exploded, cargo convoys were ambushed and destroyed. Admiral received reports of the attacks and realized immediately what was happening. The humans were not conducting random raids. They were systematically destroying the infrastructure that kept his fleet operational. Without supplies, his ships would become useless within weeks. He ordered his forces to protect the remaining supply lines. This meant pulling ships away from the Earth operation, weakening the invasion force to defend against the human offensive. It was exactly what Wei wanted. With Council forces scattered and distracted, the main human fleet moved into position. Their target was Station, the largest Council base in human space. It served as the command center for the entire invasion, coordinating troop movements and fleet operations. Destroying it would cripple the Council's ability to wage war. The Battle of Station began at dawn. Wei led her fleet directly into the teeth of Council defenses, accepting casualties that would have stopped any other species. Her ships pushed through plasma fire and missile barrages, closing the distance until their own weapons could strike effectively. The Council defenders fought with professional skill. Their ships were faster, stronger, and better armed than their human opponents. They inflicted terrible losses on the attacking fleet, destroying dozens of ships in the opening minutes of the battle. But the humans would not stop. Every time a ship was destroyed, another took its place. Every time a squadron was wiped out, survivors regrouped and continued attacking. They showed no fear and no hesitation, driving forward with suicidal determination. Captain Stone, nephew of the general who had organized Earth's defense, commanded a squadron of 12 destroyers. His ships were tasked with breaking through the station's outer defenses to create an opening for the main fleet. Stone knew the odds against him. His squadron would be exposed to concentrated fire from the station's weapons platforms. Most of his ships would not survive the approach, but someone had to go first, and Stone had volunteered his people for the mission. His squadron accelerated toward the station, weaving through defensive fire with skill born from months of desperate combat. Ships exploded around him. Friends he had trained with died in instants of plasma and flame, but Stone kept his eyes forward and his hands steady on the controls. His destroyer broke through the outer defenses with 3 other ships still following. They unleashed everything they had on the station's weapon systems, creating a gap in the defensive coverage. The main fleet poured through behind them, overwhelming the Council defenders with sheer numbers and aggression. The battle lasted 18 hours. Both sides fought with everything they had, throwing ships and lives into the conflict without hesitation. The station's corridors became as human marines stormed aboard, fighting room by room and corridor by corridor. When the firing finally stopped, station belonged to humanity. The Council fleet had been shattered, losing over half their remaining ships. Their supply network was in ruins. Their command structure was broken. Admiral escaped on one of the last surviving Council vessels. He transmitted a report to High Arbiter Eth, describing the disaster in clinical detail. The invasion had failed. The humans had not only survived but had gone on the offensive. For the first time in 12,000 years, an enemy fleet was positioned to threaten Council space itself. Eth received the report in silence. He sat in his throne room for a long time, staring at the words without truly seeing them. Everything he had believed about the Council's invincibility had been proven wrong. Everything he had assumed about primitive species had been revealed as arrogance and ignorance. His advisors gathered around him, waiting for orders. Some suggested continuing the war, gathering more ships and launching a renewed offensive. Others counseled retreat, pulling back to defend Council territory against the inevitable human advance. But Eth knew the truth. The war was already over. It had been over the moment the Council underestimated their enemy. Everything that followed was just the inevitable result of that fatal mistake. He gave the order that no High Arbiter had given in 6,000 years. He requested a ceasefire and opened negotiations for surrender. On the bridge of the Defiance, Admiral Wei received word of the Council's request. She allowed herself a small smile. Humanity had done what everyone said was impossible. They had fought the greatest military power in the galaxy and won. But she knew the war was not truly finished. The Council might surrender, but that did not mean they were defeated. There would be negotiations, treaties, and arrangements to work out. There would be consequences and complications that no one could predict. Humanity had proven they could fight. Now they would have to prove they could build something lasting from their victory. That challenge might prove even harder than the war itself. Wei looked out at the stars and wondered what the future would bring. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. The galaxy would never underestimate humanity again. 1 year had passed since the Council declared war on Earth. The anniversary was marked by a ceremony in Geneva, where representatives from both sides gathered to sign the treaty that would end the conflict and reshape the galaxy. High Arbiter Eth led the Council delegation. He walked through the halls of the United Nations building with slow, measured steps, his ancient eyes taking in every detail. Human security officers lined the corridors, their hands resting on weapons that had been impossible a year ago. They watched the alien leader with expressions that mixed curiosity with lingering hostility. Eth understood their feelings. He had ordered the invasion that killed millions of their people. He had dismissed their species as primitive and insignificant. He had expected them to kneel before Council power like every other species had done. Instead, they had fought back. They had endured losses that would have broken any other civilization. They had adapted, evolved, and ultimately prevailed against the greatest military force the galaxy had ever known. The treaty negotiations had lasted 3 months. Human diplomats had proven just as formidable as their soldiers, arguing every point with relentless determination. They refused to accept anything less than complete equality with the Council. They demanded recognition as a sovereign power with rights that could not be violated. Ambassador Sarah led the human delegation. She had been a professor of international relations before the war, teaching students about negotiation and conflict resolution. Now, she was negotiating the future of her entire species against representatives of an empire that had ruled for 12,000 years. She entered the signing chamber and took her place across the table from Eth. The room was filled with observers, both human and alien. Cameras broadcast the ceremony to every corner of Earth and every world in Council space. This moment would be remembered for centuries to come. The treaty document sat between them, hundreds of pages detailing the terms of peace. Humanity had demanded much and received most of what they asked for: full recognition as an independent species, territorial rights throughout their solar system and beyond, access to Council technology, trade networks, and scientific knowledge, reparations for the destruction caused by the invasion. But the most significant demand was also the most symbolic. Humanity wanted a seat on the Galactic Council itself. They wanted to stand as equals among the powers that ruled the stars. The Council had resisted this demand more than any other. For 12,000 years, membership had been reserved for species that had proven themselves through conquest and expansion. Humanity had done neither. They had simply refused to be conquered, which was an entirely different achievement. But in the end, the Council had no choice. Their military was broken. Their reputation was shattered. Species they had oppressed were watching closely, taking note of what happened when someone stood up to Council authority. If the Council refused human demands, they might face rebellions across their entire empire. Eth picked up his stylus and signed the treaty. His hand trembled slightly as he inscribed his name on the document. He had ruled the Council for 300 years. He had overseen the conquest of a dozen worlds. Now he was signing away privileges that his predecessors had maintained for. Sign next, her handwriting firm and confident. She looked up at Eth when she finished, and their eyes met across the table. "You should have studied us more carefully," she said quietly. Her words were meant for him alone, but the room was so silent that everyone heard them. "You would have learned that we have been preparing for this our entire existence. Every war we fought against each other, every weapon we developed, every strategy we refined. It was all practice. We just did not know what we were practicing for." Eth had no response. He had spent the past year studying everything the Council knew about humanity. He had learned about their history of endless conflict, their capacity for both terrible cruelty and remarkable compassion, their stubborn refusal to accept limits on what they could achieve. He understood now why the Council had failed. They had seen human technology and judged the species primitive. They had never considered that technology was the least important factor in warfare. What mattered was will, determination, and the absolute refusal to accept defeat. Humans possessed these qualities in abundance. They had forged them through thousands of years of fighting each other. And when a threat finally emerged from outside their world, they had turned all that accumulated experience against their attackers. The ceremony concluded with speeches from both sides. Eth spoke of peace and cooperation, words that felt hollow in his mouth. Spoke of humanity's hopes for the future, her voice carrying genuine emotion that moved even the alien observers. In the months that followed, humanity began spreading across the stars. They moved with the same relentless energy they had brought to the war, establishing colonies and outposts with remarkable speed. They formed alliances with species the Council had oppressed, sharing technology and knowledge freely. The Council's grip on the Orion Arm weakened with each passing year. Species that had been conquered generations ago saw what humanity had accomplished and began demanding their own freedom. Some asked politely. Others were more aggressive. The old order that had lasted for 12 was crumbling. Eth watched these changes from his throne room, understanding that the galaxy would never return to what it had been. The humans had not just won a war. They had shattered the myth of council invincibility. They had proven that any species, no matter how primitive they seemed, could stand against tyranny and prevail. He retired from his position 5 years after the treaty signing. His successors tried to maintain council authority, but the damage was done. The empire that had ruled the stars for so long was transformed into something new, something more equal and democratic. Humanity played a central role in this transformation. They pushed for reforms that gave voice to oppressed species. They opened trade routes that spread prosperity beyond council core worlds. They shared their technology without demanding submission in return. Some species welcomed human involvement. Others resented these newcomers who had changed everything so quickly. Conflicts arose, sometimes violent ones. The galaxy was not suddenly peaceful just because the council had been humbled. But something fundamental had shifted. The old assumption that might made right, that advanced species had the authority to dominate primitive ones, had been challenged and found wanting. Humanity had proven that courage and determination could overcome technological superiority. That lesson echoed across the stars. Historians would debate the long-term effects of humanity's victory for centuries. Some would argue that the disruption of council authority led to wars and instabilities that caused more harm than good. Others would point to the liberation of oppressed species and the spread of democratic ideals as justification for everything that happened. But everyone agreed on one fundamental point. The Council's declaration of war had been the greatest miscalculation in galactic history. They had seen a primitive species and assumed an easy conquest. They had never imagined that those primitives had spent their entire existence preparing for exactly this kind of challenge. Humanity had not just survived the invasion. They had used it as a springboard to become one of the most influential species in the galaxy. They had turned a desperate defense into a transformation of everything. Admiral Wei lived long enough to see humanity establish its 100th colony world. She died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family and honored by billions. Her funeral was attended by representatives from 100 species, all paying respect to the woman who had led humanity's counterattack. General Stone wrote a history of the war that became required reading in military academies across the galaxy. His analysis of human tactics and strategy was studied by officers from dozens of species, all trying to understand how the impossible had become possible. Ambassador Sarah served on the Galactic Council for 30 years, becoming one of its most respected members. She worked tirelessly to reform the institution from within, pushing for changes that gave voice to species that had never been heard before. And somewhere in Kansas, an old schoolteacher named Harold Mitchell lived out his remaining years in quiet contentment. He never sought fame for his role as the first human to respond to the Council's ultimatum, but he kept a recording of that transmission on his desk, a reminder of the moment when everything changed. "New phone, who dis?" The words had been a joke, a reflexive response to an unexpected message. But in a way, they captured something essential about humanity. Even in the face of overwhelming threat, humans found ways to laugh, to defy, to refuse the roles that others tried to impose on them. The Council had expected terror and submission. They had received defiance and humor instead. And that, more than any weapon or tactic, was why they had lost. Humanity had announced its arrival on the galactic stage, and the galaxy would never be the same.